Today, here in our small state, a state that has led this nation in so many ways, I am proud to announce my candidacy for President of the United States of America. Today, with your support and the support of millions of people throughout our country, we begin a political revolution to transform our country economically, politically, socially, and environmentally.
You've heard the phrase a lot lately, democratic socialist. It's suddenly very common on the left. Bernie Sanders has called himself a democratic socialist.
Which, by the way, I hope Democrats do run a democratic socialist.
Do you hope that we win? Do you want the Democrats?
No, because I think
Trump?
you'll lose spectacularly, and then I will look forward to election night when I finally get to tell everybody I told you so if you end up running a radical. Problem with socialism, in the words of Margaret Thatcher, at a certain point you run out of spending other people's money.
But people should be alarmed because socialism's greatest association has been with genocide and famine.
But I've heard Senator Sanders' comments, and it's really caused me to wonder who's left in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party.
The president spent a lot of time on using the S word, socialism and socialist.
Tonight, we renew our resolve that America will never be a socialist country.
You call yourself a democratic socialist. How can any kind of socialist win a general election in the United States?
Well, we're going to win because first we're going to explain what democratic socialism is.
Socialism is a very taboo topic in the United States. It's often associated with feelings of fear, skepticism, and even disgust. Which is why it's so crazy that on the Democratic side, one of their front-running candidates is a self-proclaimed democratic socialist. And the party as a whole seems very divided by this. On one hand, Bernie's message resonates very well with a lot of Democrats, but on the other hand, many people just view him and his ideas as anti-American. So, with this documentary, what I want to do is step away from the taboo nature of socialism and openly discuss it with the Democratic base, and hopefully learn something. So, I'm currently in New Hampshire, and we just had the New Hampshire primary. So me and my crew went out to some polling locations to ask voters for their honest takes on democratic socialism.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of wonderful things, a lot of wonderful socialist countries that happen to actually be doing better than we are. So I'm not like anti-socialism, but I will say I do believe in this country there's not a chance that a socialist could be elected. Okay. Not from here, not from Massachusetts or New Hampshire maybe, but I visit a lot of other places around the country, a lot of campaigning for other candidates. And you mention the word socialist, and you're not getting very far.
There's definitely stigma, and again, I love Bernie Sanders. I really do. I love all the candidates that are running right now. They would all be great presidents. However, when I'm knocking a lot of doors, people are scared of Bernie Sanders. They really are, and I'm scared that if Bernie's our nominee, like I'll vote for him, I'll be knocking doors for him, but if he's our nominee, I don't think a lot of people are going to vote, because I think a lot of people are turned off by the negativity.
I think of Bernie Sanders, obviously, and I think of AOC, and I think of a group of people that share a lot of my values. I have a lot of appreciation for Bernie and what he's done for the Democratic Party and bringing it further to the left, more in line with my values. So I have a very positive view of democratic socialism.
So Bernie is too far left for my taste, but I don't think he's too far left, like generally speaking. I think he's too far left to win and govern effectively, but I don't think he's a super dangerous radical like a lot of Republicans try to paint him. I think he's a guy who has his beliefs, and they're outside the norm for America, but they're very much within the norm for a lot of other countries that we aspire to be like.
In terms of addressing the idea of extreme or far left, I think the way politics has moved from where center has moved much further right, Bernie is really kind of a lot more centrist in older way of looking at things than he is categorized by mainstream media.
I gotta say, my mother and my stepfather are Republicans, and in 2016, they'd often say that Bernie is more of a Republican than Trump is.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I the old school Republicans. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, my family's all in Europe, and what's Bernie's proposing as a radical set of ideas here in the United States, they've been doing in Europe for 50 or more years. These are not radical ideas. They're doing it in Canada. This is totally doable. So I take issue with the idea of Bernie being too far left or too radical. I think Bernie's not radical enough.
Yeah, right.
As well as speaking to the voters of New Hampshire, we were lucky enough to meet with presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard and ask her a question about the rise of progressivism.
Because I'm literally like,
oh, this is your guy.
Yeah, this is my guy. Why now? Like, why is it now that people are actually taking these ideas seriously as opposed to what is feeding into this movement?
Look, I think Bernie Sanders gets a lot of credit for raising these issues on a national platform, something that really hadn't been done before in 2016, as you know, being able to bring these things to the forefront. But I think it's also just people across the country and across party lines recognizing that many of these institutions that we have now, they're working for us. And so we've got to actually fix them. So we can disagree on exactly how we do that. Bernie has his own ideas, I have my own ideas, but I think the most important thing and the positive thing is that across the country, once again, there is a cross-partisan understanding that we have to make some serious systemic change, and the status quo is unacceptable.
Awesome. I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we
All
get a
right.
picture too?
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
A few days after our talk with Tulsi, my crew and I took a trip down to Boston to meet up with Evan George, a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, or the DSA, to have him enlighten us on what exactly democratic socialism is, as well as what his organization is all about.
Hey, Chris, howdy.
Hi.
Nice to meet you. Shake your hand, Caps. And this is, we got Luke. I'm Luke.
Nice to meet you.
Hi.
Got your hands full?
I do.
We're working on
The camera guy. How's it going? Straight on through. So I have 3 roommates. I met them on Craigslist. I think 1 or 2 of them's here, but they might pop in, they might not.
Alright. Oh, this is nice.
Do y'all want water, coffee, tea?
Oh, no, one sec. Thank you.
Beer if you're over 21?
We are.
And, this is the living room, so I figured we'd probably shoot from here.
Oh, thanks.
And what we are is an organization of people that identify that the current global structure of capitalism is failing and has failed. It has not just left us all in debt, it has in fact led to the 6th extinction event in Earth's history. And so recognizing that the current structure is the problem, how do you actually rectify that? How do we as individuals scattered not just across America but the world actually come together to overthrow these massive forces and structures? We are people who like affectionately referred to as like failed sons or daughters, meaning you know, we're probably from a family that grew up middle class like mine, but then we also experienced 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the Great Recession. And basically this slow upward mobility that generations were promised really just began to become like a facade. And so as people who are now seeing that disconnect, seeing that the order that we were told actually doesn't work, we're all in debt. We're all in medical debt, credit card debt, student debt. And so it's people who have this upbringing, you've had enough of an education that you can identify some of these global forces, you know the history, and now DSA is kind of a funnel to get that population more involved with the local communities.
Aside from his work with the DSA, Evan has been canvassing for Bernie Sanders. So following our interview, we followed him to Nashville, New Hampshire with the hopes of capturing him having interesting discussions with potential voters before the primary. However, that isn't necessarily what we experienced.
80% of people won't be home.
Yeah.
And so canvassing is also a lot about dropping lit. And then we mark them all in this little app that then kind of signifies, like, did you go there? If you talk to them, how likely are they to vote? If they're not home, did you drop lit? That stuff. And this is just like how campaigns are won, is the actual data of who are you talking to and what are they going to do. So this is the first house. I can already tell you there's going to be no one there, but you go through the steps anyway. You put it a little bit under the doormat so it doesn't blow away. It also makes them bend over to pick it up so they see it, but that's okay.
While it almost seemed like a bust and most people didn't come to the door, we did manage to have a few friendly encounters throughout the day.
Oh, hey, how's it going? I was gonna make a joke that you what's a big prize, but I'm out here just talking to what's a Bernie Sanders. Sorry to bother you. Yeah,
Congratulations.
how the door's been?
It's been no. First of all, I've never done this in my
Oh!
life. Never, right? And so, okay, now I'm on camera. Okay.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
Stay
safe, it's really,
best of luck
it's really slippery. Oh, thank you.
Do you know who you'll be supporting? Bernie. That's fantastic, ma'am. Thank you so much. Just because we are kind of on camera, quick 10 seconds, why are you supporting Bernie Sanders? I'm just curious.
Well, I wanted to support him the last time, but I went for Hillary.
That's okay.
Just everything he stands for.
Grab.
Oh, God.
Oh, now we're in like a dilemma. How's it going, sir?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Loves Frisbee.
I can tell. You are all set for Tuesday?
Oh, yeah.
You know your polling location?
Oh, yeah.
Have you made a decision on who you're going to support?
I made it back in 2016.
Say it again, sir?
I made it in 2016.
Nice. Have you decided who you'd be supporting?
I made it in 2016.
And who was that, if you don't mind me asking?
Trump.
Okay. Now, for the New Hampshire primary, is there anyone running against him for the Republican Party?
Bill Wells. That's nobody.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, I know in Massachusetts there's like 2 people, but I didn't think in New Hampshire there was. Alright, well...
Are you guys supporting the candidate?
Yes, I'm out here for Bernie.
For Bernie?
Yep. Quick 20 seconds. What do you think about Bernie Sanders?
I don't care.
Okay. Any particular reason?
Don't care for a socialist. Bankrupt our country.
Well, sir,
he won't win. The Democrats are going to make sure he doesn't win. Just like Hillary, just like Democrats make sure he didn't win in 2016, they'll do the same thing.
Yeah, that's why we're hoping we can fight the Democratic Party from within, but we'll see. But
same thing.
I'm going to try to throw one more time for your dog, and then I got to go nuts.
All right, good luck with the next
one. Overshoot him. Take care, sir. Have a good day.
The word, just democratic socialism. Obviously, the word socialism is kind of, it could shut people down right away. Why do you think that is?
A lot of it has to do with the history in this country where it comes to us versus socialists. A lot of us grew up, well, none of us grew up here in the Cold War, but within the dichotomy that there is only 2 systems. It's either going to be capitalism or it's socialism. And then we have been told that capitalism is about individual freedoms, while socialism is about collective tyranny. These 2 forces battled it out for 50 years. Global capitalism won, and then in the 1990s you had what was referred to as like the end of history, Fukuyama. You had the Washington Consensus, which is capitalism and liberalism won. This is the dynamic. Anything which is related to socialism failed is evil. But what we have seen now is that now we have an entire generation of people who did not actually grow up with that Cold War dynamic that are now seeing the innate flaws within capitalism and are a lot more acceptable to something else.
This is what democracy looks like! Tell me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like! Tell me what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like!
I have a very unique path where it comes to other democratic socialists. Like, for example, so I was a freshman in high school when 9/11 occurred. I had no context of anything that was going on. I remember them saying all afternoon sports are canceled, and I'm just like, oh, great, I don't have to go to soccer. Fantastic. And I actually was trying to enlist to go fight in the Iraq War, while a lot of people who are now like my partners in the DSA were out there protesting it. And so then I attended a private military college really for the same purpose. And so I would say back then my views when I was closer to your age was what's called a like liberal interventionalist. It's somebody who says, no, like America, our military is the greatest force for good in the world. And, you know, I'd read these stories in the Time magazine, New York Times, Nicholas Kristof. There are people throwing acid in girls' faces who just want to read. We need people to go over there to stop them. And I always thought, okay, absolutely. Like, sign me up, I'll go do that. without really knowing the current dynamics that create that situation or the histories between our country and the Middle East. And so it really took a long process of my own development, but it's a little bit surprising for some people to know that, now I'm the co-chair of DSA, whereas, again, 15, 20 years ago, I was trying to enlist in these very conflicts.
Good evening. We begin with the latest on the coronavirus.
Cases confirmed a coronavirus.
The Chinese coronavirus epidemic.
So, we are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And although I'm going to still be making this project, obviously some changes did have to be made to just the structure of what I had originally intended with this film. So I had another interview planned with somebody else, but that all fell through. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm just going to re-follow up with Evan and discuss COVID more and sort of just round out what he was saying before and how it relates to this new situation that we're in. So, let's just cut right to that. There you are.
How's it going?
Good. Thank you for agreeing to do the follow-up interview. I appreciate
it. Okay, round two.
When you look to the future in a post-COVID world, no matter when that'll be, because who knows, but when things settle down and businesses start to reopen and there's some semblance of normalcy, what lessons do you think will have been learned from this, and do you think the American people might be more willing to embrace some of these ideas brought by Bernie Sanders and the DSA, since we had just recently, had to have gone through a very difficult time for everybody?
That is definitely the optimistic view, and you can take some issues in how a crisis, while unfortunately it tends to favor the elements of power, it tends to favor capitalism. You can also see how a lot of issues that are really to the left of where I was 2 months ago are now almost becoming mainstream. So I've been fighting for rent control here in Massachusetts, along with many other organizations and people, for the last few years, just giving Massachusetts the right for different cities to have rent control. Now we're at a period where we're calling for rent freezes, and we're even going beyond that, we're calling for the cancellation of rent. So these are the sort of ideas that 3 months ago would have been completely unheard of, even by socialists such as myself, but now these are things that we're advocating for. And, people use the phrase that you've returned to normalcy. Probably one of the most important things to keep in mind is that we will not be returning to what we can really call either an imaginary normal in terms of what Trump tries to promise his constituents, or as Biden once said, nothing will fundamentally change. If this global pandemic doesn't get through to people that those are not the options, that the only way forward is going to be something radically different, and that can look like a fascist state like developing in Hungary, or that can look like hopefully a democratic socialist state. And those are really the two choices that we have going forward.
So all is said and done, and I'm actually quite surprised that, my initial hypothesis at the beginning of the film has been proven wrong. After talking with Evan and also all of those voters, Democrats are actually a lot more accepting of democratic socialism than I had originally thought. So although Joe Biden is now the presumptive nominee for the Democratic Party, it's safe to say that the Democratic Party as a whole is beginning a shift further towards the left. And whether or not this will last, we have yet to see. But based on everything that's going on, it's clear that democratic socialism, it may not be as scary as people originally thought. And a lot of these ideas are definitely here to stay.